The moment didn't arrive with headlines, and it didn't break through in the way public revelations usually do. There was no dramatic press conference, no sudden archival leak, no carefully staged media unveiling. Instead, it surfaced quietly, in the tone of reflection, in the weight of memory, and in the kind of confirmation that only comes when a family decides a silence has lasted long enough. According to long-standing accounts surrounding Jack Benny's private world, what his daughter ultimately acknowledged was not a scandal or a surprise, but something far more enduring, that the public version of her father had always been only part of the story. Behind the timing, the jokes, and the perfectly controlled comedic pauses that defined an era of American entertainment, there existed a far more deliberate life, one shaped by discipline, precision, and an almost obsessive understanding of how image and reality must coexist to sustain stardom. In her reflections, the family's long-held understanding finally took form in words, that the man audiences believed they knew was never an illusion, but carefully maintained balance between performance and privacy, crafted not to deceive, but to protect. And as those acknowledgments surfaced, they didn't rewrite history so much as deepen it, revealing how tightly controlled his world had been even offstage, where every silence carried intention, and every anecdote was filtered through a lifetime of showmanship. It was his realization, quiet, restrained, and long accepted within the family itself, that reframed his legacy not as a mystery solved, but as a portrait completed, with the final brushstrokes added decades after the curtain had already fallen. The confirmation did not arrive as a spectacle, nor did it attempt to rewrite the past with dramatic force. It came instead as something far more restrained, a carefully spoken reflection from Jack Benny's daughter that carried the weight of years, not headlines. There was no sense of revelation for shock value, no attempt to overturn what audiences believed they knew. Rather, it felt like the closing of a long-held family understanding finally stepping into public view, gently, almost reluctantly, as though the story had matured enough to be spoken aloud. For decades, Jack Benny's public image had remained one of the most precisely crafted personas in entertainment history. To audiences, he was a master of timing. The pause that said as much as a punchline, the comedic hesitation that became his signature, the self-aware humility that defined his radio and television legacy. But within the private sphere of family memory, as his daughter later suggested, there was always a deeper recognition that what the world saw was only one carefully maintained layer of a far more complex life. According to her reflections, the family had long understood that nothing about Benny's public presence was accidental. Every gesture, every silence, every moment of apparent improvisation was shaped by discipline and repetition. Even in private, the boundaries between Jack Benny the man and Jack Benny the performer were not easily dissolved. The same instinct that allowed him to command an audience also governed how he managed intimacy, privacy, and personal space. It was not separation born of secrecy, but a structure, a life built around controlled perception. What she ultimately confirmed was not a hidden scandal or forgotten controversy, but truth that quietly persisted within the family for years. That his greatest creation was not a single joke, a radio program, or a television persona, but the seamless coexistence of two identities. One lived under spotlight, calibrated for timing and public affection. The other existed in quieter spaces, defined by discipline, routine, and an almost architectural sense of order. As she spoke, the tone remained reflective rather than revealing. There was acknowledgement, but not astonishment, understanding, but not disruption. It suggested that the family had never experienced a sharp divide between public myth and private reality, only a gradual awareness that the two had always been intentionally aligned. In that sense, the confirmation was less about discovery and more about articulation, giving words to something long observed but rarely expressed. Within the broader context of his legacy, this framing added a new layer of depth rather than contradiction. It reinforced the idea that Jack Benny's artistry extended beyond performance itself and into the careful construction of a life that supported it. Even his silences, once seen merely as comedic timing, now appeared as part of a larger philosophy. That control of rhythm both on stage and off was central to maintaining authenticity in the eyes of an audience. And so, what emerged from his daughter's reflections was not a dismantling of the legend, but quiet expansion of it. The man behind the comedy was not revealed as different from the performer, but as inseparable from him. The boundaries between stage and life, already blurred in his work, were shown to have been even more deliberate than audiences ever realized. In the end, the family's long-held understanding did not challenge history. It completed it, not by adding shock, but by adding clarity, not by exposing contradiction, but by confirming consistency. And in that confirmation, Jack Benny's legacy settled into something even more enduring. Not a figure split between reality and performance, but a single, continuous presence shaped by both, refined over time, and finally understood in full. The confirmation did not emerge in the way the public usually expects from revelations tied to legendary figures. There was no dramatic unveiling, no sensational framing, no attempt to turn memory into controversy. Instead, it arrived slowly, almost carefully, through the words of Jack Benny's daughter, shaped by time, softened by reflection, and grounded in a lifetime of private understanding that had never fully been put into public language until now. For decades, Jack Benny's name had stood as one of the most meticulously controlled identities in the history of American entertainment. To audiences across radio waves and early television screens, he was the embodiment of comedic precision, the deliberate pause, the understated reaction, the carefully timed expression that turned silence into humor. His persona was so consistent, so refined, that it often felt effortless. But according to his daughter's long-considered reflections, what appeared effortless was in fact the result of an extraordinary level of internal discipline, maintained not only on stage, but throughout his entire way of living. Within the family's private understanding, this was never a hidden truth in the dramatic sense. It was simply reality as they knew it. That Jack Benny did not switch off a performer when the cameras were gone. Instead, the structure of performance remained present in subtle ways, in how he observed situations, how he controlled timing in conversation, and how even ordinary moments seemed to carry a sense of rhythm. The boundary between public entertainer and private individual was not erased, but carefully managed, as if both identities were required to maintain balance. What his daughter ultimately confirmed was not a secret waiting to be exposed, but a continuity that had always existed beneath the surface. The family had long understood that his comedic genius was inseparable from his personal discipline. Every on-air hesitation had a counterpart in real-life awareness. Every comedic delay reflected a deeper instinct for control and observation. In her telling, there was no rupture between Jack Benny the man and Jack Benny the performer, only layers of the same instinct expressed in different environments. As she reflected further, the portrait that emerged was less about surprise and more about recognition. She described a life in which precision was not limited to performance schedules or scripts, but extended into daily behavior, habits, and even silence. There was a sense that nothing around him was ever entirely unmeasured. This did not suggest coldness or distance, but rather an almost artistic commitment to maintaining structure in a world that thrives on unpredictability. For those outside the family, this confirmation reframed what had long been assumed to be natural charm or instinctive humor. It suggested instead that Jack Benny's legacy was built on sustained intentionality, that the timing audiences admired so deeply was not just comedic talent, but a philosophy of presence. He did not merely react to moments. He shaped them, even in subtle, unseen ways. And yet, his daughter's tone reportedly carried no sense of demystification or disappointment. If anything, it conveyed respect for the complexity of what he had built. There was an understanding that such a life required more than talent. It required maintenance, awareness, and a constant negotiation between visibility and privacy. The performance, as the family understood it, was not a mask, but a framework through which he engaged with the world. Over time, this framework became indistinguishable from personality. That was perhaps the most important nuance in her confirmation, that the public image was not false, but incomplete on its own. It was only one expression of a larger, continuous identity that extended beyond the stage lights and studio audiences. In that sense, the revelation did not contradict the legend of Jack Benny. It expanded it, grounding it in the reality of sustained craft rather than spontaneous brilliance. As this reflection became more widely discussed, it added a new dimension to how legacy itself is understood, not as a fixed portrait frozen at the height of fame, but as something constructed through repetition, discipline, and long-term coherence. The idea that a performer could maintain such consistency across decades now felt less like mystery and more like method. And so, what his daughter ultimately brought forward was not disruption, but completion. A quiet acknowledgement that the man audiences thought they knew had always been exactly who he chose to be, but that who he chose to be was far more structured, deliberate, and enduring than anyone outside his inner circle had fully realized. In the end, the confirmation did not change Jack Benny's legacy. It refined it. It removed the illusion of simplicity without removing the truth of brilliance. And what remained was a portrait not divided between man and performer, but unified, a single, continuous figure shaped by intention, sustained by discipline, and finally understood to the voice of family memory that had waited a lifetime to speak. The confirmation did not arrive as a headline moment or a dramatic unveiling. There was no sudden interview designed to shake long-held assumptions, no public confrontation with the past, and no attempt to reshape history for effect. Instead, it surfaced quietly through the voice of Jack Benny's daughter, in a tone shaped less by revelation than by reflection, as if she were finally giving language to something the family had always understood, but rarely expressed outside its own private boundaries. For decades, Jack Benny had existed in the public imagination as something remarkably stable, a performer whose identity was so consistent that it almost felt timeless. His humor was built on restraint rather than excess, on timing rather than noise, on the almost invisible art of knowing exactly when not to speak. Audiences came to recognize him not just for what he said, but for how long he waited before saying it. That pause, deliberate, controlled, and unmistakably his, became more famous than many punchlines around it. Yet according to his daughter's reflections, that same sense of precision was not something he stepped into only under studio lights. It was something that followed him, in different forms, throughout his life. Within the family's long-held understanding, there was never a sharp separation between Jack Benny the entertainer and Jack Benny the private man. Instead, there was continuity, a sense that the same instincts guiding his performances also shaped how he moved through everyday life. Timing, awareness, control, observation, these were not stage techniques he switched on and off. They were habits of perception, woven into the way he experienced the world. Conversations were not rushed. Reactions were measured. Even silence carried intention. To those closest to him, this did not feel like performance in a theatrical sense, but like a deeply ingrained way of existing. What his daughter ultimately confirmed was not a hidden scandal or a forgotten secret, but something far more subtle. That the public version of Jack Benny was never meant to be seen as a mask,